It all began on a quiet morning in Berlin at Humboldt University, where Professor Martin Hina, a respected figure in the world of linguistics, was reviewing a series of audio recordings. The room was filled with voices from all corners of the globe, American, British, Australian, and even Singaporean. Yet, as he listened, one voice in particular stood out to him. It was a Filipino voice, that of a young English trainer from Cebu, reading a passage on clarity and empathy in speech. As the words flowed, there was something remarkable about the way the speaker connected with the audience, something neither stiff nor overly theatrical, but deeply human. Professor Hina paused the recording, his brow furrowing in quiet contemplation. What if I told you this might be the most precise English I've heard all year, and it's not from Oxford or Harvard? His words hung in the air, leaving the students in the room startled and intrigued. For years, Germans had been taught that proper English was best learned through Western models, the British Queen's English or the refined accent of American universities. The idea that someone from the Philippines could offer something so clear and measured felt almost contradictory. Weeks later, at an education symposium in Frankfurt, Professor Hina would meet a Filipino teacher named Elena Ramirez, whose work would change the way Germany saw Filipino English. Elena, a 34-year-old teacher from the Philippines, wasn't a celebrity, nor did she hold prestigious degrees from Ivy League institutions. Yet, the students who had learned under her tutelage spoke of her not just as a teacher, but as someone who had transformed the way they approached the English language. They spoke of how, under her guidance, English was no longer just about speaking perfectly, it was about speaking clearly, with kindness. Elena's teachings emphasized clarity, but not in the way one might expect. She didn't push for the polished accent of the British or American variety. She taught her students how to communicate effectively and empathetically, focusing on understanding rather than mere perfection. Over time, this approach spread. Professionals in Berlin who took online sessions with Filipino tutors began noticing subtle, but significant improvements. It wasn't just their pronunciation that had improved. Their confidence, empathy, and listening skills flourished as well. At first, German media treated it as an interesting novelty, something to write about on a slow news day. But the results were undeniable. Major German universities started to notice that students who practiced with Filipino tutors were making tangible improvements. Professor Hina, curious about this phenomenon, began conducting his own research. He spent days and weeks analyzing sentence rhythm, tone, and pauses in speech. What he discovered was something he had not expected. Filipino English, he noted, had something that was lacking in the dominant Western models, a kind of human clarity. As more and more German educators and corporate leaders began to understand the value of Filipino English, the term human clarity started circulating. It wasn't just about speaking a language, it was about connecting with people on a deeper, emotional level. Schools in Hamburg, Munich, and Cologne began inviting Filipino trainers to conduct English immersion sessions. The feedback was overwhelming. Many Germans described their experiences as the first time they had ever felt that English was approachable, not just a tool for business or academia, but a means to connect, to share, to truly understand one another. But for Elena, this journey was not one she had anticipated. Growing up in the rural town of Bohol, with a mother who taught English to local children and a father who repaired boats, Elena's ambitions were humble. She never dreamed of working abroad, let alone having her voice influence an entire country. Her dream was simple: to help her students speak English with confidence, to let them know that they could use the language without fear. When she was invited to train a group of German engineers remotely, she laughed. Why would they want to listen to someone like her? She didn't know her voice would soon echo in lecture halls across Berlin, or that her teaching would become a cornerstone of a cultural shift in how Germans would understand English. The first time she met Professor Hina in person, he said something that stuck with her. When you speak, it's as if you're not teaching. You're guiding the listener home. Elena was taken aback. She had never thought of it that way. She simply believed in speaking with kindness and clarity, in teaching in a way that didn't just focus on perfect pronunciation, but on connection. Soon, Professor Hina's research paper, titled The Filipino Standard of Clarity, would be published. His conclusion was stark. Filipino English wasn't just a variation of a language, it was a new standard, a model that combined empathy with precision. Universities began citing Filipino teachers in their linguistics courses, and German companies adopted the tone of Filipino English as a model for their customer service training. Even the German Ministry of Education took notice, and Filipino tutors were recognized as leaders in cross-cultural communication. Yet, back in the Philippines, Elena and her fellow teachers had no idea how their voices were quietly reshaping Europe's understanding of English. They continued their online classes, often working late into the night, without knowing that their lessons were now being taught on a global stage. Elena's approach wasn't about sounding like the British or the Americans. It was about communicating in a way that made others feel heard and understood. And as Germany continued to embrace this new way of speaking, Elena's story began to grow, quietly but profoundly. But as the influence of Filipino English spread, a deeper question began to emerge. Could this simple, compassionate way of speaking truly change the way the world communicates? Would the Filipino approach to clarity become the global standard? It was a question that would set the stage for the next chapter of Elena's journey, one that would take her beyond the classrooms of Germany and back to the Philippines, where her people's voice would find its rightful place in the world's dialogue. And it was in this next chapter that a remarkable discovery would be made. Clarity wasn't just about how you speak, it was about how you listen. And that would be the true test of whether the Filipino way of communication could change the world. But that revelation was still to come, waiting in the wings of Elena's evolving story. The quiet but powerful revolution of Filipino English was already underway in Germany, but it wasn't just confined to the classroom anymore. Elena's methods, based on clarity and empathy, were beginning to seep into other sectors of society. German executives, engineers, and even government officials were increasingly choosing Filipino tutors to guide their English practice. They didn't just want to speak the language well. They wanted to speak it in a way that made them feel connected, understood, and heard. One of the most striking examples came when a major international conference in Munich invited Elena to give a keynote on the evolving role of clarity in cross-cultural communication. She stood before an audience of corporate leaders, linguists, and educators, all eager to hear her thoughts on what had become a growing trend. Her message was simple, yet profound. Clarity in communication is not about perfection. It's about connection. It's not about sounding like the Queen or like an American TV anchor. It's about making the other person feel heard. Her words resonated deeply with her audience. They had spent years focusing on technicalities, the precision of their language, the rules that govern grammar, the standard of pronunciation. But something was missing. The warmth, the empathy, the understanding, the human connection that made language not just a tool, but a bridge between people. In that room, a shift began. The idea that English was just about speaking with precision started to fade, replaced by the belief that clarity was about understanding each other. Filipino English had become more than just a tool for communication. It was a philosophy, a way of approaching life itself. This was something the Germans were beginning to understand, and it had a profound effect on their corporate world. Companies that once prioritized accent reduction and native-sounding English now began to focus on a different metric: clarity of message, empathy in tone, and the ability to engage with people in a meaningful way. In the months that followed, Elena received invitations from corporate giants like Siemens, Lufthansa, and Bosch. These companies, known for their technical excellence, now sought to bring the human element into their communication training programs. They wanted their employees to speak with warmth, to show confidence through clarity, and to let their words convey sincerity rather than just technical precision. For Elena, however, it wasn't just about corporate success or even personal recognition. It was about the message, the realization that communication wasn't something to dominate or control. It was something to share, to understand, to nurture. She recalled the first lesson she ever learned from her father, a fisherman in Bohol. He had always spoken little, but each word was chosen carefully, with intention and sincerity. When you speak, he had told her, make sure it's not to impress. Speak so they understand. That philosophy stayed with Elena, even as her teachings were being lauded across the world. But not everyone was thrilled by this new approach. Traditional linguists and academics, particularly in Germany, began to voice their concerns. The idea that Filipino English could become the global standard of clarity was seen by some as a challenge to long-held beliefs about linguistic authority. Critics argued that the Filipino approach, with its emphasis on empathy and tone, was too soft, too informal, and lacked the structural rigor they believed was necessary for global communication. One such critic, Dr. Karl Reimer, a professor at Heidelberg University, was particularly vocal. Clarity, he argued in a public debate, cannot be based on emotion alone. It must come from the structure of the language, from its syntax and grammar. To suggest otherwise is to undermine the essence of linguistic precision. Elena, however, did not flinch in the face of these criticisms. She was confident in her approach and invited Dr. Reimer to observe one of her classes, hoping that the experience would speak for itself. Reluctantly, he agreed. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Reimer attended Elena's sessions, sitting quietly in the back of the room as she guided her students through the intricacies of empathetic communication. He watched as students, initially unsure of themselves, gradually became more comfortable speaking and listening with intention. They were no longer just repeating words, they were connecting to their audience, their tone reflecting their sincerity, and their words embodying genuine understanding. 3 weeks later, Elena received an unexpected message from Dr. Reimer. The subject line simply read, "You were right." In the body of the message, he admitted that his initial skepticism had been shattered. He acknowledged that the clarity Elena taught went beyond mere grammar and syntax. It was about the heart of communication itself. The transformation in Germany was happening quickly now. Elena's teachings were no longer a fringe movement, but a respected practice, deeply embedded in the way companies, schools, and even governmental bodies communicated. The German Ministry of Education adopted Filipino clarity techniques into their own curriculum, and universities began referencing Filipino English as the standard in linguistics programs. As one academic journal put it, Filipino English represents a new, global paradigm of communication, a model that fuses precision with humanity. Yet, even as her influence grew, Elena remained humble. She continued to teach online in the quiet hours of the evening, never forgetting the lessons she had learned from her roots. But as the world began to embrace her approach, a deeper question started to stir in the back of her mind. Could this movement, which had begun in the quiet classrooms of Germany, extend beyond Europe? Could the Filipino way of speaking, with all its empathy, clarity, and warmth, become the new standard for global communication? One day, she received a letter that would change everything. It was an invitation from the United Nations in Geneva. They wanted her to speak at a global conference on cross-cultural communication. The topic was simple yet profound: how the Filipino approach to clarity could change the world. Elena sat quietly in her apartment, staring at the letter, her hands trembling. This wasn't just another speaking engagement. It was a recognition of everything she and her people had worked for, a moment to take the Filipino voice to the global stage. But there was a catch. She would be addressing an audience of diplomats, world leaders, and policymakers. These were the very people who had once been skeptical of her approach, the ones who still clung to the belief that language could only be measured by its structure and prestige. Would they listen to her? Would they embrace the Filipino way of communication, or would they dismiss it as yet another trend? The pressure was immense, but Elena knew she had to go. This was her chance to show the world what Filipino English truly meant, not just as a language, but as a tool for connection, understanding, and compassion. The flight to Geneva was long, and as the plane descended toward the city, Elena felt a mix of excitement and fear. What if they didn't understand? What if the world wasn't ready for this? When she stepped onto the stage at the United Nations, she saw a sea of expectant faces. World leaders and diplomats, all waiting to hear what she had to say. The room was quiet, and all eyes were on her. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. But as she prepared to speak, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something even bigger, something that would reshape how nations communicate with each other. And then, just as she opened her mouth to speak, a loud voice from the back of the room interrupted. "Elena, are you really ready for the world to hear what you have to say?" The question came from none other than Dr. Reimer, who had traveled to Geneva to see her speak. Elena's heart skipped a beat. What was he implying? The room fell silent. And as she locked eyes with Dr. Reimer, Elena realized that the true test of clarity was not just in how we speak, but in how we choose to listen. What would happen next could change everything. The room at the United Nations in Geneva was silent. Elena stood at the podium, heart pounding in her chest. The echo of Dr. Reimer's question lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. "Elena, are you really ready for the world to hear what you have to say?" The words seemed to reverberate not just across the room, but deep within her. For a moment, she felt as though the entire weight of the world was pressing on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. Elena had spent her life teaching students in humble classrooms, guiding them with patience and empathy, showing them the power of clarity in communication. She had never envisioned standing before the most powerful diplomats in the world, representing not just herself, but an entire movement. The Filipino way of communication was no longer a personal journey. It had become a global cause, one that transcended borders, cultures, and languages. And now, standing in front of this distinguished audience, Elena realized that the true test wasn't just about how well she could speak, but about how well the world could listen. She took a deep breath and let the moment settle within her. For the first time, she truly understood what her father had taught her all those years ago. Speak so they understand, not so they're impressed. The lesson, so simple yet profound, had carried her through every challenge, every doubt, and every obstacle. Now, it was time to apply it on the grandest stage of all. "Thank you," Elena began, her voice steady and clear. "I stand before you not as a speaker, not as an expert, but as a person who believes in the power of connection. I come from a country that has often been overlooked in global conversations, a country where English is spoken not to impress, but to connect." Her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of everything she had fought for. She continued, "For years, we were told that to be successful in English, we had to sound like someone else, someone from the West. But what if I told you that true clarity in communication doesn't come from perfect grammar or a flawless accent? What if I told you that clarity comes from how we make others feel when we speak?" She paused and looked around the room. The diplomats and leaders sat in rapt attention, their eyes fixed on her. Elena could sense their curiosity, their willingness to listen, and that gave her strength. This was her moment to change the conversation, to show them that clarity wasn't just about what we say, it was about how we make others feel. "Clarity," she said softly, "is not about perfection. It's about making the other person feel understood. It's about using language to build bridges, not walls." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, she could see the shift in their faces. The skepticism that had once clouded their expressions seemed to fade. Elena was speaking not just to their intellects but to their hearts. And in that moment, she realized that true communication wasn't about what we say or how we say it. It was about what others take away from it. But as she continued, Elena knew that this moment was just the beginning. The question Dr. Reimer had posed echoed in her mind. "Are you ready for the world to hear what you have to say?" She understood now that the challenge wasn't just about convincing these diplomats of the merits of Filipino English. It was about convincing the world to embrace the kind of communication that valued empathy over perfection. "Filipino English," she continued, "is a product of our history, our culture, and our way of life. We didn't learn English to dominate or to impose. We learned it to survive, to connect with others, to make ourselves understood. And in that process, we discovered something profound. Language is not just a tool for communication. It's a tool for understanding, for building relationships, for creating connections across cultures." The room was still, each word sinking in deeper. Elena knew that what she was saying was radical. She was challenging everything the world had come to believe about language and communication. She was asking them to look beyond the surface and to see the humanity in language, the rhythm, the warmth, the clarity that came from speaking with kindness. As she spoke, Elena couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought her here. From the quiet streets of Bohol to the lecture halls of Berlin, from her humble classroom in Cebu to the grand stage of the United Nations, she had never imagined that her voice, her simple, humble voice, would come to represent something so much larger than herself. She wasn't just advocating for Filipino English. She was advocating for a new way of communicating, one that prioritized empathy over ego, connection over perfection. And yet, as much as she believed in the power of her message, she knew that change would not come easily. There were still those who believed that language should be about precision, about rules, about sounding like the standard native speaker. There were still those who saw Filipino English as an anomaly, something to be tolerated but not celebrated. But Elena was determined. She had seen the transformation in Germany, in the classrooms and boardrooms, in the way people began to listen, not just to the words, but to the intent behind them. She had seen how her students, once unsure of themselves, had begun to speak with confidence, not because they were trying to sound perfect, but because they were speaking with clarity and heart. The time had come to ask the world to do the same. She looked out at the sea of faces before her and asked, what if the world stopped measuring English by how well we imitate others, and instead measured it by how well we connect with one another? What if we started listening not just for the right words, but for the emotions behind them? A hushed murmur swept across the room. The question wasn't just about language anymore. It was about a fundamental shift in how people communicated, how they understood one another. And as Elena stood there, she realized that this wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for all the teachers, all the call center agents, all the Filipino workers around the world who had spent years speaking English with patience and humility, often unnoticed, often undervalued. She continued, the Filipino way of speaking is not about dominance. It's about humility. It's about understanding that language is not a weapon to be wielded, but a bridge to be crossed. It's about the clarity that comes when we speak with intention, with kindness, and with a genuine desire to be understood. And then, as the room seemed to hang on her every word, Elena asked the question that would shape the next chapter of this journey. Are we ready to listen? Really listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts? Are we ready to accept that clarity is not something to be achieved through perfection, but through connection? At that moment, Elena knew that this wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. She wasn't asking for the world to change overnight. She was asking them to change how they thought about language, how they thought about communication. It wasn't about sounding perfect anymore. It was about sounding clear, sounding human. The room remained silent for a long moment. And then, slowly, one by one, the diplomats began to nod. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were taking notes furiously, trying to capture every word, every thought. Elena had done it. She had shifted the conversation. The room was no longer filled with skepticism or resistance. It was filled with understanding, with a shared recognition that language, at its core, is about connecting people, not about impressing them. But just as Elena thought she had reached the summit, a new challenge emerged. A figure in the back of the room stood up. It was a well-known linguist from Harvard University, a man who had long championed the traditional models of English. His voice boomed across the room. This may be an inspiring message, Elena, but can you prove that this new approach works on a global scale? Can you show us that Filipino English is more than just a temporary trend? Elena's heart skipped a beat. The question was a sharp one. It wasn't just about whether Filipino English could change perceptions. It was about whether it could work across cultures, across languages, and across borders. Her eyes locked onto the professor, and for the first time since she began speaking, she felt a wave of doubt. Could she prove that Filipino English was more than just a movement? Could it truly be the global standard for communication? The room held its breath, waiting for her response. And just as Elena opened her mouth to answer, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room. The door flew open, and a figure stepped into the room, none other than Professor Martin Hina. The very same professor who had first discovered the power of Filipino English, the man who had championed her teachings in Berlin. The audience gasped. What was he doing here? What would he say? Professor Hina stood still for a moment, scanning the room. And then, with a steady voice, he said, "It's not about proving anything, Elena. It's about showing the world that clarity, real clarity, comes when we listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts." The tension in the room dissolved in an instant. And, as Elena looked around, she realized that the true battle wasn't just about defending Filipino English. It was about opening the world's ears, hearts, and minds to a new way of communicating. And so, as the debate raged on, Elena knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Because the next chapter of her journey would take her beyond borders, beyond cultures, and into the hearts of millions of people who were ready to listen.